Good morning, everyone, and welcome. On behalf of the TLC Steering Committee, we're excited you're all here to kick off the University of Arizona Global Campus's 2021 Teaching and Learning Conference. My name is Morgan Johnson, and I lead our Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning here at UAGC. This is our 7th annual Teaching and Learning Conference, and we're welcoming attendees near and far from all over the world, right here in Arizona, all the way to the Ukraine. This year's conference theme is Strengthening Our Foundations, Learning Theory Online and Across Disciplines. And over the next 3 days, you'll hear sessions from faculty, staff, students, alumni, and thought leaders across higher education. The TLC program boasts 20 panel tracks and more than 100 presentations from professionals representing nearly 20 institutions. This year's conference theme really challenges us to revisit the foundations of our work with a focus on learning theory. Strengthening our understanding of how we consume, process, apply, and experience information will ensure that learning is at the core of our efforts. Our drive to understand and experience learning is key to our ability to build equity in access and completion to higher education. New to TLC this year is our conference platform, Whova. You can access sessions on our conference site, and we encourage you to download the Whova desktop or mobile app and search UAGC Teaching and Learning Conference to view sessions, engage with attendees in formal and informal events, and access session materials with interactive experiences. I noticed this morning there's already a couple of Midwest meetups that are being planned, it looks like. We hope that over the next 3 days, you'll feel energized, inspired, and have an opportunity to collaborate with one another on ways to best support our academic communities in achieving their goals. In a year when we've continued to be at a distance from one another, we're very excited to connect virtually as a community. We're thrilled to be kicking off TLC this morning with our opening keynote session. Please help me welcome Dr. Steve Nettles to introduce our speaker.
Hello, everyone. I'm Steve Nettles, AVP of Institutional Effectiveness here at UAGC, and I have the pleasure of opening a session on a topic that is very, very close to my heart, understanding how to improve the value of post-secondary education through equitable student access, support, and completion. With that, it is my honor to introduce Dr. Jennifer Engel. She is the Director of Data in the United States Program for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She is an expert in improving workforce outcomes through higher education and leads the foundation's data team in this area. It's an understatement to say that Jennifer has an extensive background in educational policy and practice, having served at the Pell Institute, the Education Trust, and the Institute for Higher Education Policy. Her areas of focus include access, affordability, and completion, with a focus on underserved student populations, and she is currently leveraging educational data to address post-college equity gaps in workforce outcomes. These topics are critically important to the field of higher education in general, and here at UAGC in particular, where we also leverage data to better understand our students and serve them appropriately. With that, we are very proud to welcome Dr. Engel and to learn from her today. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Steve and team. Really appreciate the opportunity to be with all of you here today to open this conference and to hopefully contribute to the dialogue at this year's Teaching and Learning Conference. As Steve mentioned, my name is Jennifer Engel, and I'm the Director of the Data Strategy for the U.S. program at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. My work focuses on strengthening the data pipeline from early learning to K-12 to post-secondary to the workforce so that we can more equitably serve students of color and low-income students through our education to workforce systems. Today, as Steve mentioned, I'm going to focus my presentation on the work of the Post-Secondary Value Commission, which we supported over the last 2 years and which released a series of reports earlier this year. This week, the Commission will release its final product, a public data tool that will allow most colleges and universities the opportunity to begin to explore equitable value on their campuses. Now, when we started the work of the Commission in 2019, we really could not have imagined the current situation facing our nation's students and the institutions that serve them. This work is even more important to us at the Foundation now for 3 reasons. The first is who we need to serve better. Black, Latinx, Indigenous, low-income communities have been hit the hardest by the health, economic, and racial justice crises facing this country. The second is what we need to do better. We need to make sure that post-secondary education makes good on its promise to lift students and their families up to experience economic and social mobility. We cannot afford to keep losing millions of students before they complete and before they can benefit from their credentials. And we're losing so many of them right now. I know you all are seeing the same stories that I'm seeing, and you're seeing it on your campuses. We're losing students who will not transition in as they had planned and they prepared for, and we're losing those who have transitioned out and don't see a way back. Third is why we do this work and why we need to do this work. Post-secondary education needs to be part of the solution to dismantle systems and practices that reproduce racial and economic inequality, and that means action on the part of institutions, policymakers, and foundations like ours. So why consider post-secondary value in this context? We know from the research that a college credential is increasingly important to achieving any economic mobility in this country. Yet the rising price of college for students, plus still too low completion rates, is putting the surest route out of poverty, out of reach for far too many students, especially students of color and students from low-income circumstances. Over the course of 2 years, the commissioners met to work on this really critical issue. The commission included a really diverse group of 30 leaders in the field, as well as 2 students. This group was racially, politically, and professionally diverse to really come together to tackle this important yet complex issue. The core work of the foundation or the commission included a definition of post-secondary value and a set of core principles. It also included developing a framework for measuring post-secondary value and an action agenda with recommendations for institutional leaders, policymakers, and other stakeholders. This work was never intended to merely be a research project, though it is informed by the latest data and research. It is intended to spur action in the field, and it's already doing so through work underway at ASCU, the University of Texas System, Northern Arizona University, and more. So after much consideration and iteration, this is the commission's value definition. Students experience post-secondary value when provided equitable access and support to complete quality, affordable credentials that offer economic mobility and prepare them to advance racial and economic justice in our society. That last part of the definition really came out of conversations that the commission had in the wake of the national reckoning on race in this country over the last year and became an important part of our definition of post-secondary value. The principles that you see here were also developed by the commission to really ensure that the work was communicated in a way that it puts equity at the center. And it also reinforces that we all have a role to play to advance equitable post-secondary value from institutional leaders, policymakers and advocates, the public, foundations, and others. So while we began this work focused on equitable economic returns, given concerns about widening income and wealth inequality in this country, in particular by race, over the course of its deliberations, The commission broadened its scope to also consider non-economic value. And I think importantly for this audience, the commission also thought about the role of the institution. The role of the institution certainly to help students proceed along that pipeline to equitable value, access, affordability, support, completion, earnings, but also the role of institutions as equitable employers, as engaged community members, and as anti-racist educators. So the commission really developed a holistic view of post-secondary value through its work by considering both economic and non-economic value for both students and society. Today, I am going to share some of our work related to economic value, equitable economic value in particular, given the current financial crisis in this country and its disproportionate impact on students of color and students from low-income circumstances. The commission and the research task force, which had about 20 additional experts, worked not only to define value, but also to measure it. To measure economic returns, the commission created this series of thresholds that range from minimum economic return to economic mobility to economic security. Unfortunately, we cannot yet measure economic security or wealth parity due to data limitations. But the commission felt that it was really important, given what we learned from researchers like Fenaba Otto about racial wealth disparities in this country, and the role that higher education can play in exacerbating those by burdening Black and Latinx students with too much loan debt. So the commission felt it was really important to signal that post-secondary education has a role to play to put students on a path toward economic security. Threshold 0 is not misnamed. It is intentionally named Threshold 0 because bare minimum economic returns are not an acceptable outcome. A student meets this threshold if they earn at least as much as a high school graduate in their state, plus enough to recoup their total net price within 10 years. Thresholds 1 and 2 measure whether students reach median earnings in their field overall and whether they reach earnings parity with white men. These thresholds are based on David Troutman's work from the UT system on in-field pay inequities. Threshold 3 is informed by Raj Chetty's work, and this measures whether students earn enough to enter the 4th income quintile or above, or experience economic mobility, regardless of their field of study. So what I'm going to do next is share some of the top line findings from the commission research to show the power of these measures to create dialogue and hopefully change on campuses. The full findings from the commission were released earlier this year, as I mentioned, and can be found on the commission's website. The framework was tested with national data from the College Scorecard, IPEDS, Census by Jordan Matsudera, former associate professor at Columbia. The framework was also tested using much more robust student-level data from the University of Texas system by David Troutman, who leads their institutional research and improvement work there. As I'm sure some of you are well aware, there are a number of limitations to the scorecard and IPEDS data. In the scorecard in particular, we cannot disaggregate completers from non-completers with respect to earnings, and we can't yet disaggregate median earnings by race, income, or gender. But the commission felt it was important to test the framework with the best available public data to show trends about the extent to which different sectors and institutions may be providing equitable value, and to provide a way to engage institutions now with available data in the value conversation. So 2 key findings from the college scorecard research that I want to share. The first, the good news. Most public and private nonprofit institutions do provide a minimum economic return to students 10 years after entry as measured by threshold 0. However, this is not the case for the for-profit sector, where most institutions with available data, and I say with available data because the for-profit sector had a lot of missing data in this regard, but those with available data overall do not meet this minimum benchmark. And there are about 700 institutions that were within the data set that don't meet threshold 0 in this time frame. Now, again, this is one data point. It helps us raise questions about what might be driving institutional performance on a measure like threshold 0. How might we look at the institutional context to better understand why that institution is or is not passing threshold 0? Looking at funding patterns from state and other entities, looking at the net price for students and the extent to which that might be contributing to setting a high bar for threshold 0, looking at completion rates, which we know is one of the biggest predictors of students' post-college outcomes. So when we look at a measure like threshold 0 or threshold 1 or threshold 2 or 3, it's really about giving us a way to ask questions about how students are faring post-college and what we can do to put them on a path toward economic mobility and success. So the not so good news from this analysis is that using the scorecard data in almost every sector, median student earnings are below median AA and BA earnings in their state 10 years after enrollment. Now, this is partly due to not being able to disaggregate completers and non-completers earnings in the scorecard. But that doesn't make the finding untrue. It makes it difficult to answer why the finding is true or what's contributing to the finding, but it does really represent a real and concerning outcome for students, especially for students who did not complete their degree, but did incur costs, and in some cases, substantial debt. One of the most striking findings from the UT research, and I'll share some more of that here shortly. One of the most striking findings from the UT research for the commission was that students who left the institution without a credential on average had already spent about $25,000 attending the institution. Those students are now without that credential. They may have incurred that through debt or other means. And if they're students of color, we'll see here shortly, the impact of non-completion is even more detrimental for them when they face workforce discrimination on top of not having the credential that they sought. So let me transition to some findings from the UT research. As I said, the UT data are excellent. They are really at the vanguard of the field in terms of having robust student level data linked to earnings data, both within their state and from the census, so they could fully test the value framework. They could disaggregate by completion and non-completion. They could disaggregate by race, income, and gender. They could disaggregate by program level. And so part of what we'll be sponsoring later this year is an opportunity for other institutions and systems that want to conduct the kind of analytics that the UT system did as part of the commission. We'll be creating what's called the Value Data Collaborative to allow other institutions and systems to do the same kind of work under the guidance of David Troutman and other analytical advisors that we will have as resources to institutions that join this effort. So key findings from the UT research. First, among completers, earning disparities by race, income, and gender exist in year one after college, and they grow over time. These disparities are even larger in certain fields, such as STEM, which is shown here. This raises really important questions about the role of post-secondary institutions in providing equitable career pathways for all students. A finding like this also, though it's focused on economic returns, can help institutions and programs reflect on what are the learning outcomes and skills associated with students' post-college outcomes, and how might we ensure that we're equitably preparing students in terms of those knowledge, skills, social capital needed to transition into the workforce in such a way that where they start their career helps put them on that path to economic mobility and beyond. And we know that the UT system has actually started doing just that as they've been interrogating their data over the summer from this project. They've started looking at the mapping that they've done to skills and learning outcomes so they can better understand what that relationship is between those competencies and students' post-college outcomes so they can improve instruction and programs. The second finding that I want to share from the UT work is that high social value fields with lower wages on average, like education and humanities, can provide its graduates with economic mobility while still meeting vital social needs. It's noteworthy when you look at the UT data that there are almost no gaps in post-college earnings by race in education, though education graduates do earn less than their STEM counterparts. But again, this raises questions around how do we prepare teachers? All teachers often have a very structured professional component to their programs, which is equitably accessed by all students within those programs because it's a requirement. And so it raises questions about how we can build that kind of structure into other programs to put students of color, low-income students, and women on that same path as their peers. Also, this was a really important analysis because one of the questions that we heard often when starting a conversation about post-secondary value is, aren't you going to undervalue fields like education and humanity by looking at post-college earnings? And I think what's really striking about these findings is that, again, it does show that these programs can and should put their students on a path to economic mobility. Will they earn as much as their STEM counterparts? No. Can they still earn enough to have not just a family sustaining wage, but enough to really thrive in their families and their communities and contribute to the social good through their work? And that answer is yes. And so this is the kind of analysis that is going to be important for other institutions to do to see if their programs in education and other high social value fields are also preparing their students to achieve economic mobility. The third finding from UT, and I referenced this earlier, is that completion matters immensely, especially for Black and Latinx students in terms of their economic outcomes. I know this chart is really hard to read. I will share this presentation afterwards, but all of these charts are also available in the reports that the Commission published earlier this year. But it's a really important one because what we can see is that at the median, Black and Latinx non-completers do not start to earn enough to recoup their investment until between 5 and 10 years after leaving college. So these are students who were enrolled, who either paid directly or incurred debt, and they don't start earning enough until 5 to 10 years later to even start being able to pay off that investment. That's a really striking finding when we consider that education is meant to be a pathway out of poverty, and we need to ensure that we're actually providing that pathway. White students, however, are somewhat more insulated from non-completion because they do tend to, on average, have higher earnings regardless of whether they complete. So for example, in the UT data, we can see that after 15 years, white non-completers earn nearly as much as Latinx completers from the UT system. Fourth, equitable value is not just about economic returns. It's about ensuring equitable access, equitable completion, and equitable post-college outcomes for students of color and students from low-income circumstances in particular. To that end, the Commission also created a series of metrics that measure how students from underrepresented groups both complete their credentials and experience a positive economic return at a given institution, and measure how much that institution contributes to the economy by equitably serving these populations. So taking two examples here from the UT system, Institution A is a Hispanic serving institution. 86% of its students, of its graduates are Latinx students, compared to only 13% in Institution B. Now, students at Institution A do tend to, on average, make slightly less than students from Institution B, and they tend to pass threshold 0 at slightly lower rates than Institution B. But because Institution A serves so many students of color, so many Latinx students, their equitable value index is 5 times the equitable value index for Institution B. And the amount of money that they contribute to the economy based on their Latinx graduates who are earning more than that, minimum economic threshold is likewise, multiplicatively higher. And so it's really important, and really what this is meant to underscore is that this is not just about identifying which institutions have the highest earnings and sorting or ranking institutions from there. This exercise is not about rankings. This exercise is about understanding students' post-college outcomes, understanding the potential drivers of those outcomes, whether it be net price, completion rates, institutional resources available for instruction. And it's about putting those earnings in the context of who the institution or program is or is not serving. So this really kind of leads into the last part of the research that I want to share with you here today, which is work that was done by the Georgetown Center on Education and the Workforce. What they did was essentially a thought experiment. And they essentially said, what would the economic returns to society be if we closed equity gaps in post-secondary attainment? And then they further looked out to see, and what if we also closed pay gaps that remain? And what if we close wealth gaps that remain? Because higher education is part of, but is not the entire solution to the gaps that we see in broader society. But even just looking at what the economic returns to society would be if we closed educational attainment gaps by race and income, you can see that that's about $1.18 trillion annually in public returns. It's hard to put a price on equity, But when you can see in black and white just how critical and impactful it is for our country to attend to equity in post-secondary outcomes, it really puts an important point out there in terms of how we can all win when we invest in equity for Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and low-income students. So while my presentation has focused on economic returns to post-secondary education, I do want to mention that the Commission conducted quite a bit of research on critical non-economic benefits, both for students and for society. We had Stephanie Markham at Gallup do a paper on well-being and explored the different facets of students' post-college well-being, whether that's financial, whether that's related to community, whether that's related to their social and psychological well-being. They have done pretty extensive research to look at the extent to which college graduates are experiencing not just financial well-being, but other types of well-being that are critical to their not just having a better living or earning a better living, but also having a better life. We also commissioned work from Richard Aram and his team on the latest with respect to measuring learning outcomes. And his paper not only gives a really good background on different aspects of learning, learning outcomes, the different areas of learning outcomes, but also talks about a project that they have underway to find some new and unique ways to measure student learning outcomes, including students' interactions through digital learning platforms and advising platforms and other types of digital tools that are in pretty frequent use by institutions these days, but leveraging those to help us better understand in real time what students are learning. We also commissioned work on the skills gap and thinking about, from the employer perspective in particular, what are the skills that students are not emerging from higher education with on average, and how can we better match what students learn through their post-secondary education with what they need to be successful in the job market. Finally, we also commissioned work on justice as a critical outcome of post-secondary education. And here, this was focusing on what is the role of post-secondary institutions with respect to promoting and really ensuring social justice in our society. We talked earlier, I mentioned earlier, a couple of roles that institutions play in terms of their role as equitable employers, institutions' role as engaged community members, but probably even most importantly is higher education educates future doctors, lawyers, nurses, almost every profession, police officers, almost every profession is touched by, and its leaders are touched by, the higher education experience. And so it's an opportunity to really shift the way the field approaches issues related to fair and equitable post-college hiring, employment, and earnings. Because post-secondary education, we are educating the future decision makers who are going to decide who to hire, how much to pay them, and whether or not to really ensure equitable pathways for students of color and low-income students. So I'll close my remarks by sharing the Commission's action agenda. As I mentioned, the work of the Commission was never meant to be a report that sits on a shelf. It is truly our sincere hope that faculty and staff, institution leaders in particular, will use the framework to understand and uncover barriers to equitable value on their campus, from access to affordability, to completion, to post-college outcomes, and to also use the framework to identify ways to remove those barriers so more students of color and low-income students can experience the life-changing benefits of post-secondary education for themselves, their families, their communities, and our country. With that, I'm going to pause and open up for comments and questions so that we can have a dialogue about this work.
Thank you so much, Dr. Engel. I invite everyone in the audience to feel free to use the chat to share your comments and questions. And also, I'm going to post in the chat right now 3 questions that Dr. Engel has provided in the discussion forum that is on the Whova app in the community section. I'll post them in the chat here. We can discuss them together live, but also we hope that you all will engage with them in the community forum. And while we're waiting for folks to read and come up with their questions, we got a question already. Okay, good. Dr. Engel, can we hear more about how employers define the skills gap in your data?
Certainly. Thanks for the question, Karen. So in the paper that we commissioned for this work, it was written by Jobs for the Future and really focuses on, oftentimes we hear skill gap and really they would like to reframe it as skills gaps because there are a number of different skills that employers are focused on that they aren't necessarily seeing from all graduates that they're bringing on board. Some of those gaps fall into kind of your communication skills. And so those I think are fairly well discussed with respect to, students developing the language and communication skills to really thrive in the workplace. There's also critical thinking skills and the ability to work in team-based environments is another set of skills, which is, really important. And then there's digital and technology skills, given the way our workforce has evolved. So these are a couple of the sets of skills that are discussed in the JFF paper. I don't know offhand if the skills gap paper aligned with the NACE competencies. So that's a good follow-up question. But I think that, again, this is an important part in what we've seen I mentioned at the UT system, they're now starting to back map. So if we're seeing these outcomes for these students in these programs, they did an exercise a couple of years ago to map out skills and competencies related to their courses. And now they're trying to bring those pieces of information together so that they can see where those gaps are. I think another important skills gap is just around social capital and networks, because we see, especially for students of color, low-income students, first-generation students, that social capital gap is really critical. Not having that network to draw on from your own community and not having that hidden curriculum made explicit in terms of how to navigate from education to the workforce is another really critical area.
Dr. Engel, some of the skills gaps you mentioned, technology, for example, strike me as also being barriers to access to education in the first place. Can you talk a little more about what some of those specific barriers were that your data showed, maybe, for example, from UT system?
Yes, so the access barriers in particular, a lot of our work did focus on post-college outcomes, but especially when you look at post-college outcomes in the context of who institutions are serving, it becomes really critical to think about those access components. And I think the pandemic just exacerbated every one of the access barriers that we've been working to overcome for the last 10, 20, 30 years. Digital divide is an issue that is more, pressing than ever. But when you look at the numbers that are coming out of the National Student Clearinghouse and elsewhere that are showing the precipitous drop in enrollment, it is predominantly low-income students and Black students who are being hit the hardest by the pandemic, either not transitioning into higher education as they had planned, or dropping out and not finding or having a path back. And those were the two populations that had the lowest college going rates to begin with, and we're seeing the greatest enrollment declines. And so it truly is an enrollment crisis for those student populations because they can't access the benefits of higher education if they can't even get through the front door to begin with. So it's a really critical issue, especially right now. There's a question about how to advise an online university to support students to ensure greater outcomes. So our work at the foundation focuses in a few critical areas. And of course, there are others that are really critical to this gap. But our post-secondary success team in particular focuses on digital learning and how to improve student engagement with digital content, but also increase the quality of that content such that students have a truly adaptive learning experience. This is especially important when we think about developmental education. The research pretty resoundingly has shown us that developmental education, as we've been administering it over the last 20 years, is ineffective. And not only ineffective, it actually pushes students out of the higher education pipeline. And so, the move toward co-requisite remediation, where students are taking the college level course with additional support, is one of the key ways that we can bolster the online learning experience for those students who, again, matriculating into that course without taking a separate remedial education course is going to increase their outcomes, but not if there aren't additional supports built into the course as well. So that's one critical area. A second critical area is around advising. Surveys of the student experience routinely identify advising as one of the most underutilized tools that institutions and programs have at their disposal. And so there's been quite a bit of advances in the technology to help us identify students who are potentially at risk with early warning, indicators, et cetera. But we also have to build new practices around that technology. There was a campus that we worked with that said, one night we turned on the early warning system, and in the morning we had hundreds of flags of students who were at risk of not even completing that term, let alone their degree. They didn't have the people infrastructure in place to respond to what the technology was highlighting. So really thinking about what the staffing component is and what the engagement model is that helps augment the data-driven or digital tools that can help us identify these issues, but we can also use the tools for greater communication and easier communication with students, pushing information to students, but they also still need someone to connect to. But the technology can help improve that experience as well. What we learned from a community college that we had worked very closely with for a number of years was that they previously, a student would go to the registrar's office and then the financial aid office and then to their advisor. And there was no online or digital paper trail that had any record of what students discussed in any of those encounters. And so a student would go to the registrar would say, go take it up with financial aid. Financial aid would say, go take it up with your advisor. And yet the student had to start their story over every single time because there wasn't really a way for the adults who were doing this work to connect with one another and to help problem solve, what was a barrier in students' path. So really leveraging that technology, but then thinking about the people capacity and deployment strategy to help address the concerns that it raises. And the third area where we focus, well, I guess I did mention that already. We focus on digital learning, advising, and DevEd, bringing that into the digital space. Those are the three major areas that we focus on at the foundation, but certainly financial aid and thinking about unmet financial need is a huge potential risk factor for students, as well as thinking about transfer and credit mobility, and especially in an online environment, thinking about how to ensure that students' prior credits can count so that we can get those students who left, especially during the pandemic, back in and back on track. Let's see, there's a couple of questions here. Where do we expect to see student debt load relief for minorities in the next 10 years? What will be the potential options? So this truly is a crisis, the student debt crisis for Black students in particular. And I shared just briefly some of those numbers at the top. But when we see, for instance, that Black students and low-income students are more likely to borrow than their counterparts. Low-income students, even though we have the Pell Grant, we all know the Pell Grant doesn't pay what it used to pay out. When I got the Pell Grant for my undergrad, it paid half the cost of going to a public four-year institution. That is no longer the case. That same four-year institution, many years later, I won't give an exact figure, it now costs 3 to 4 times as much per year to go to that same public comprehensive four-year institution in Ohio than it did when I went, and the Pell Grant has gone up maybe $2,000 in that time frame. So it's really, we need to look at the numbers with respect to how much debt we're asking low-income students and students of color in particular to take on, because they are taking on more debt than their counterparts. And yet they're still also less likely to complete because we don't always have the supports in place to make sure that we can help support them through successfully to completion. And so the default rates for students of color, Black students in particular, low-income students are extremely high, like over 50% high. And defaulting on your student loans is really catastrophic to your finances. And it's difficult to bounce back from that. So, post-secondary education, if you think of like, what's the Hippocratic oath for post-secondary education? We should at least do no harm. And we're doing harm by really loading debt onto students that are not being properly supported through the system for success. And then they are bearing the cost of our systemic failure personally in their own lives as they're trying to make their way in the world. So I don't think I had an answer to you except to say I agree it's a terrible problem. I do think that there are some discussions in the broader policy context right now around debt relief that I think are really critical. Some of certainly there's proposals to increase the Pell amount, not as much as has been called for by advocates in the field, but there are increases that are being contemplated in, the Build Back Better plan, which, they released some language on last week. There's additional support for minority serving institutions contemplated in that plan as well. When we looked at in the commission's work, when we looked at the relationship between institutional expenditures per student and students' post-college earnings, there's a pretty clear relationship there. And we also see that institutions where more than 25% of their enrollment are students of color or low-income students, in some cases have up to half of the amount of resources in terms of instructional expenditures per student. So when we talk about value, it's not just about providing the students with more direct financial aid, which would increase that value proposition for the students. It's also about ensuring that we're equitably financing the institutions that are serving students of color and low-income students. And so I think that's part of the debt equation, is how we finance those institutions so that they can better financially support their students as well. So I see there's another question here. Open access institutions, non-traditional. So in terms of, the outcomes and the framework from the commission, it really, this framework is meant to be applied to any type of institution or program. I think what's important is to think about what are the contextual variables that help us understand a open access four-year institution's, performance relative to an elite institution's performance. And I'll just say, I actually don't care about elite institutions' performance on these measures, except they need to enroll more students of color and low-income students, because the access component is the way that they can contribute to more equitable post-secondary value. I do care a lot about open access community colleges, four-year institutions that need additional resources to serve this really critical and growing student population. And so, I think that our recommendations are really focused on those institutions. I mentioned a data tool that will be coming out later this week that leverages the best publicly available information from the college scorecard, from IPEDS, from the census, and every institution for whom we had data. There are some gaps in which institutions are in those data sets, but every institution for which data were available will have the opportunity to look at their students' earnings relative to the value framework. And we hope that that's a way for institutions to start to enter this conversation. They'll also be able to look, and there's a view of the data that allows institutions to look at their performance relative to other similarly diverse institutions. Because again, it's not about elite institution versus open access. It's, I'm an open access institution. How are other institutions doing that have similar resources to me and who are serving similar student populations? And so the tool is really meant to have institutions focus on finding those peer institutions and learning from those institutions about what they might be doing, whether it's looking at their completion rates to see if they're higher or lower, looking at their net price to see if it's higher or lower. And so there will also be contextual variables added or that are available in the tool as well on completion, net price, time to credential, et cetera. And so again, these will likely cause institutions to have more questions than answers, but we think it's a worthy dialogue. And again, as we said, we're going to be sponsoring this follow-up group to really go deeper with their data, to be able to do the kinds of in-depth analyses that the UT system did. And that group is going to create a research agenda for what value research looks like for the next 2 or 3 years. And I think as part of that, they're really going to get into better understanding what the levers are that are available to open access institutions serving adult learners, et cetera. Right now, the data we have are more indicative of what happened, but not why. And so we hope that the next phase of the research can really start to focus on why, so we can focus on what to do.
That's really exciting. And while I have you here, I have to ask a research question to geek out just a little bit. You spoke on some of your COVID data and what you're seeing. Has the impact or the results from those data changed your research agenda in any way, or added research questions that you're now investigating?
So I think, the issue on access is really critical. And so at the foundation, over the last year, a couple of new initiatives emerged in response to just the realities that students and institutions are facing during COVID. One was we launched a cross-functional pathways strategy team. And that's really about, we previously and still do have an early learning team, a K-12 team, a post-secondary team, a mobility team, but we weren't really focused on the connections between those teams. And so now we've got a team that is laser focused on the high school to post-secondary transition and really focusing on the access component and thinking about how we can get better data, not just to advisors, but also to students and families themselves to help them make decisions about which institutions offer them the best chances of success. And so we've, as a result of the pandemic, really focused a lot more in that area. I also mentioned credit mobility. We're doing a fair amount of work that we weren't doing previously around credit mobility, because again, there are so many students who started, left during the pandemic, and now need a way to bridge back in. And so we're doing a lot more work there as well. So those are two examples of ways that we've kind of expanded our remit at the foundation with respect to COVID that I think is really critical. And then this issue of post-college outcomes has really become, and the importance of better workforce data. So my team is very focused on how do we get the data we need to answer critical questions in higher education, and how can we leverage that data to improve student experience and student outcomes. And so we've built a whole data advocacy agenda around why can't we answer these questions? Like why aren't the data disaggregated by completers and non-completers? That is something that can be done and should be done. We know that there were limitations previously. Those limitations have been addressed. That information needs to come out into the public domain. Institutions need way easier access to earnings data. Right now, there's so many institutions that are trying to have to purchase that data from, private entities because they can't get an MOU with their state labor agency. So we've got some initiatives around. So one initiative is with the National Student Clearinghouse called the Post-Secondary Data Partnership, which is intended to help institutions look not just at lagging, but also leading indicators or early momentum indicators of student success. And it's aligned with the post-secondary metrics that matter framework that I have put out a couple of years ago. So that's one initiative I would suggest. And the other initiative is through the Coleridge Initiative, where states are starting to share earnings data across state lines so that institutions can get easier access to understand what their students' outcomes are and help broker that relationship between state agencies and institutions, because you shouldn't have to pay to find out what happened to your students or run expensive surveys. Like that information should be in the public domain, and we're trying to democratize and open those data sources safely, securely, protecting privacy, but in a way that really can drive the field in a much more data-driven way.
Well, that would certainly help our institution. I can speak to you. We struggle at times to accurately report the success of our students in relation to more traditional type institutions, and we also suffer from a lack of comparable data in which to do that in many cases. So we welcome all help in that area every time we can get it.
Great. Well, we would love to talk with you all about the Value Data Collaborative as that gets off the ground later this year. That'll be one of the first ways that we're helping to connect institutions with these data.
Absolutely. We would love to do that.
That's great.
Do we have any more Q&A questions?
I do see one more question in the Q&A, and I'm going to try to paraphrase because I think it is a great segue into our conference sessions and into the afternoon keynote we have from Dr. Karen Sibley. The question is, how important is student support in terms of psychological well-being and things like that for their success, especially during the context of COVID? And so I think that the segue that I'm trying to make with that question is, Dr. Engel, you ask us, how can we support the discussion of post-secondary value, student support, and things like this on an institutional level? So I just wondered if you had any sage words for how we can support that across the institution. These are big ideas for leaders to think about, but also for everybody down to faculty, advisors, student support staff, et cetera, to consider.
Yeah, I think, in our closing 30 seconds that having these type of data, they're directional. They can tell us, whether they can't always tell us why. So thinking about what are the why metrics that you as an advisor, or you as a faculty member, or you as a student support staff member, what are the actionable real-time metrics that you need that might ultimately add up to whether or not a student completes or has a successful post-college experience? But what are the things that you need to know and track on a regular basis so that you can adjust your approach with students in real time? And so I think making the data personal and local is an important part of that work.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And this was a very, very powerful entree into our learning this week. I just thank you so much for your time and your expertise. I felt like you were speaking about our students, to our institution, to me. So sincerely, thank you. Thank you. We appreciate everything that you've done, and we hope you have a lot of luck and success in the future, and bring all of that knowledge right back to us so we can use it.
Great. Thank you all so much for having me. Have a great conference.
Take care. Have fun, everyone.